We would like to thank Dream at the beginning of this panel for sponsoring this conversation. Everyone knows that Amazon seeking a second headquarters has been not only the talk of the town, but the talk of the continent. The unusual process that Amazon has engaged in has put cities in an interesting position and regions in an interesting position in thinking about how to sell themselves to attract a significant amount of jobs and investment in their cities. There were 238 submissions, 11 Canadian cities submitted to the opportunity. As many of you likely know, Toronto made the final 20 list and is still in the running. And it's an interesting question that we're going to discuss on the panel today. Should a Canadian city, should Toronto be the prime candidate for Amazon's second headquarters? It has an incredible workforce, quality of life. We, of course, have national advantages, as Mayor Tory spoke about in his opening remarks, positioning our healthcare, our public healthcare, and our public education system as being critical parts of the Amazon bid, that we have a pipeline of workers who will access great health care, but also educated people coming into the system who can supply a workforce. There are a whole variety of ways that cities approached this bidding process. Some of them, I would argue, showed their best colors, and some of them groveled in a way that didn't look so good. And Richard Florida has a lot of commentary on this, if you're interested in seeing a bit of some of the criticism of the approach to the Amazon bid. But the team that we have with us today, in fact, is front and center of really what is a seminal process to redefine how cities think about themselves in relation to big corporate headquarters. And we're going to have a discussion today that will illuminate what that process was like, what some of the implications have been, and in some ways, the way we've changed the way we think about our city regions forever as a result.
So what's exciting about this conversation and what we thought was interesting is, yes, it's about Amazon, and we're going to learn a lot about the process, but we're going to learn about cities and what Vancouver, Toronto, and Ottawa faced and what they've learned through this process. And it truly is about branding. If you got my comment earlier on about, I don't think we do a very good job of branding ourselves as a country with Goldie, I think it's an interesting moment of reflection. And quite frankly, it was a very starry moment for Canadians for us to see the hard work that went in and how we start to express ourselves. So we have Bryan Buggey, Acting Chief Executive Officer from Vancouver Economic Commission, Toby Lennox, the Chief Executive Officer of Toronto Global, and Blair Patacairk, Vice President of Global Expansion of Invest Toronto. We also have Ottawa, yeah. Ottawa. We have wine.
I'm going to go work for Bryan.
Exactly. So they've already started drinking before you started.
Yeah, we have the wine, by the way.
But we're going to talk a bit about Amazon and all things, I think, which is exciting. And it's going to be a bit of more of a free-flowing conversation, a couple of questions to sort of warm you up, a couple of more detailed questions, and then some rapid fire, I think, is the way we're going to do this today. So welcome, gentlemen. I also give you props for your sock game, solid sock game. Excellent, well done. And away we go.
So let's begin with the question of subsidies. I hinted at it in my opening comments. Canada is, we're a little bit smug about the fact that we did not see this as a race to the bottom. We were conscious that we have attributes as cities that in fact make us appealing, that we didn't in fact need to in some way incentivize uniquely Amazon coming into the Canadian market. Give us a little bit of your thought on that, some of the thinking that went into that approach. Did we play it right? And how do you think we're faring against the 19 other cities? Toby, why don't we begin with you?
Well, as part of the process, I went out to Seattle right after the RFP was released, and went and talked to the trade commissioners in Seattle, did a tour. And it was very clear to me in that conversation that what Amazon's issue was the supply of talent. This wasn't a real estate play, it was the supply of talent. And so the question we started asking ourselves was, is there any amount of money that we're gonna be able to put on the table that's gonna make a difference to them? And it's gonna make a difference to the question of the supply of talent. And I think the other part of it that we felt very strongly about was, what is the Toronto region? It is growing, it is dynamic. You know, an additional 50,000 jobs here in the over 10 years when we're receiving 90,000 people anyway. It was more of an attitude towards Amazon that we are having success here. You can come and join our success. We just couldn't find two things. One, an incentive that was going to be relevant to them, and we just genuinely didn't think it was going to be fair to the Ontario and the Toronto region business community to say, for some reason, we're going to give piles of cash to somebody who doesn't need it. It was just something we couldn't justify, which is actually another reason why we're one of 2 cities that made our entire bid book public, because we wanted to assure people that there was not a secret deal that was going on where, you know, there was some back channel, you know, source of money that was going to them.
So is that true? Only 2 cities made their bid public?
Boston and Toronto. Yeah.
Amazing. What have they got to hide, those other cities? Well, that's really what this gets at, because obviously there's things that are offered there that might not necessarily be in the public interest. Otherwise, why would they be hidden? Yeah. Blair, tell us your thoughts on this question of talent, subsidies, positioning Ottawa.
Well, I've long held the view, to your point, that I think it's a bit of a race to the bottom if we're just going to roll up a Brings truck and put some money on the table. I've been in the business a long time, like Toby and my partner, Bryan, and you know, sometimes it works and a lot of times it doesn't work. When Ed Clark came out and said, listen, we're going to take a look at this to try and make sure that the economy is strong and that we have the right talent, and we're going to do that by looking at some of our programmings, we all checked the box and said the right way to go. Because you can throw all the money you want at it, and at the end of the day, if you're giving it to a big company like Amazon, you know, they're going to put it where they need to put it, regardless of the term sheets that are being done. But if you start investing in your communities and you start investing in your own backyard and saying we need to get better talent or we need to grow the talent that we have, those are music to our ears. If you start saying that we're going to invest in infrastructure, which by the way is one of the biggest things you're going to need to have, whether it's Toronto, Vancouver, Ottawa, anywhere, your infrastructure has to grow. And that was the other thing the government of the day had said at the time, that we want to invest in the infrastructure. And I remember going back to our mayor, and I was saying to our mayor, he kept asking, you know, are we going to put incentives, and who, you know, federally or provincially? And when we had the discussion around the table that we're actually investing in the future, everybody shook their head and said, this is the right way to go, and we all got on board with that and headed in that direction.
That's great. So this was actually a concerted kind of Canadian strategy. There was an interplay. It's not a coincidence that the approach was very similar. That's what it's sounding like.
Right.
Bryan, do you want to weigh in on that? And we would also I would also like to just throw one more question at you, because, you know, we just had this big announcement 2 weeks ago about Amazon bringing 3,000 more jobs to Vancouver.
Yeah.
You might feel a little bit like you've won already.
Yeah, we've got the silver medal. We don't know who's got the gold, but we've got the silver medal, and we didn't know that we were already part of HQ1. So we spent a lot of time and effort thinking we were distinct and separate, but you know, we now have a float plane that can go from Cole Harbour. You can walk from an Amazon office in downtown Vancouver to a float plane. That's about a 15-minute walk. Get on the plane, it's an hour and 5 minutes to Lake Union in downtown Seattle. You walk off the plane right into the Amazon campus in the South Lake Union. We're literally an hour apart.
Wow.
Pretty special when you're flying at 1,000 feet above the San Juan Islands, and you're looking at, you know, the Olympic Peninsula on the right and Mount Baker and Mount Rainier on the left, and you're looking down at all the sailboats. Absolutely spectacular. So why wouldn't talent want to be moving to the Pacific Northwest, Vancouver included? So, you know, we got a lot of advantages baked in, but in terms of incentives, we just ran the numbers based on our own local conditions, and we looked at commercial real estate, we looked rates, we looked at talent and the cost of talent in Vancouver, we looked at healthcare costs, we looked at a variety of other factors, and over a 10-year period, we identified, without providing any incentives, a $34 billion savings over 10 years. So at that point, why on earth would we even need to offer any other incentives? So we just went full in. This is who we are, and away we go.
That's a great question.
We just wanted to mention that site that they chose for the 3,000 employees. That was in our proposal as one of, it was the first recommendation of the 4 sites that we provided in the proposal. So wouldn't you know it, I think they kind of looked at the, hey, we like that one, let's take it.
Well, what's interesting is that opportunity to sort of canvas a wide market, brilliant marketing strategy on Amazon's part, but we're going to get to the opportunities that may not be the prime opportunity, although I'm not sure that it is the prime opportunity entirely. It's all those, all those spill out opportunities. I want to talk about partnerships and boundaries, because I think it's really interesting, because when you look at the bids and you look at where this went, one of the things we talked a lot about today was regionalization, connectivity, communities and areas. Ottawa, went through an amalgamation process, went a little bit across the border and said, hey, how do we do this? Toronto took an interesting strategy of saying, we're a region and we have a whole bunch of opportunities to offer you. Vancouver also took a look at this in a different way. Can you give us a little bit of insight on what that has done for you to date and what that potentially could mean for the future of your cities?
Well, Toronto Global was established in February of last year. And we represent, as I say, from Burlington to Clarington and from Lake Simcoe to Lake Ontario. When we sat down and started looking at the scope of what Amazon was going to require, we realized we needed to draw upon an even larger, cast a wider net. So we were already set up on a regional basis. And I think one of the things that we have seen over and over and over again is that companies are coming into regions because their demands for talent, for suppliers, for all that is starting to spill over into boundaries. And the only thing in that context that's different about Amazon is they were just really big. We dealt with a company that was looking for 80 different languages, 4 different dialects of Portuguese. They rode the rails for 2 days in the Toronto region to figure out where their employees were going to come before they chose a location that was 2 blocks north of Union Station. So what you're starting to see is that fabric of a region is becoming a determining factor in how companies are approaching municipal centers. So Amazon really was, like, there's no way any one city within the Toronto region was going to be able to meet what they required, even the city of Toronto.
All the more important the discussion on transit that we had this morning and how we're going to start to connect our region, and if we don't, and we don't make this a priority, how we will be looked at in the future.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and it was interesting that Amazon spent so much time focusing on the question of transit, but I don't, as I say, the question of connectivity of our region is a talent question, is a location question. You desperately need it, and companies are very, very aware of what is good and what is bad in the transit area, and so it's a question we answer all the time.
It's interesting, I'll just interject a moment, Blair, but it's interesting because I think historically when we talked about transportation in relation to economic development and businesses, we were actually talking about goods movement, that what mattered was being close to a highway where transport trucks could arrive with materials. And I think it's important to be explicit about this. When we're talking about transportation, now, today, we're talking about moving people.
Absolutely.
And we're talking about, it's really, when we talk about transportation, we're talking about quality of life for employees. And that's a completely different framework than existed 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago. It's all about how can people have a really high quality of life who are going to work in these companies.
That's right.
Yeah. Just going back on the regionalization piece, I'll take it a tick up. And a lot of people know this narrative, but in Canada, you have Global Affairs Canada running around doing foreign direct investment. You have ISED doing it now. You have the new investment hub doing it, which is Invest in Canada. You have the Trade Commission Services doing it. You have the provinces doing it, and you have every single city, big, small, medium, all of us are doing it. It was a brilliant move, to your point, that Amazon put this up and said, you guys deal with that.
8 pages.
8 pages, that's it. It changed the way I think we ought to be doing this kind of bidding, or as a company should be doing a bidding. So on the regionalization piece, just really quickly, we amalgamated in 2000, and we thought that might be the end of it, but no such luck. When Amazon came along, we met the minimum criteria for 1 million people, And we added another province and another city to beef up the catchment area, which basically is our economic footprint, which was Quebec and a city called Gatineau. It's forever changed the way we'll do business. Yeah. It just has. Because in the world that we live in now, you have China nipping at your heels, you have India, Latin America, you have all these other areas. So I'm not competing against Toby and Bryan and anybody in this room. I'm competing against the world every single day. And you wouldn't believe how many times we've had, since our bid went in and conversations across Canada, we also belong to something called the Consider Canada City Alliance, working with the 13 cities across Canada to do foreign direct investment with GAC and the Prime Minister's office, et cetera. And now we're seeing across Canada regionalization where regions are coming to us beyond just the cities we're working with saying, hey, we want to get on board with this because it makes sense so we're not tripping over each other. And by the way, we're the size of California.
Bryan?
On regionalism?
Just on sort of, on the idea of, if you want to add anything.
Consider a super region. Consider Vancouver, Seattle, Portland. 12 million people, if you include all the cities in between, and a bullet train that could get us to Seattle and Portland, you know, and lickety-split. So we see that as when we want to compete at a global scale. We know Vancouver's only 2.5 million. It'll be 3.5 million by 2040. But you need to be much bigger than that. There's probably going to be about 50 mega regions around the world. We need to be teaming up with Seattle and Portland in what we would call a super region to become globally competitive at scale. So those conversations are happening right now. We've got it really been led by Microsoft, another great company just an hour away, and lots of other organizations in both Washington State and BC that are really looking at the infrastructure to get us connected so that we can just collaborate more effectively and really present to the world a new kind of brand called Cascadia that could be quite significant in terms of its economic might, because you know Boeing is there, and Starbucks, and Microsoft, and Amazon, and Costco, and lots of other amazing companies already based in that region. Intel has a huge footprint in Portland, and so forth.
So this is very interesting. Here you have a huge company coming in saying, show us what you've got, and in response, if I understand Blair correctly, you basically look at what you've got and you say, hold on a minute, we actually need to think of ourselves in a fundamentally different way. We need to expand our boundaries, we need to think of our assets in another way in order to respond to the scale that is being proposed here. Mm-hmm. I'm curious about the impact that that thinking has had on, you know, you said that it's fundamentally changed the way you think about the city in its regional context and how these cities work in concert now. I'm wondering about the impact, really, that this bid has had on kind of the psyche or the identity of the region. I think in Toronto it was very clear there was this real sense, all for one, one for all, at the regional scale, as opposed to a sense of competition. You know, it would be interesting, Bryan, to kind of hear, since you are the winner here with the silver medal, does that hold true in the Vancouver context as well?
Sorry, in the...
The idea of now that you think of yourself in a different way. You've talked about thinking regionally in relation to Seattle, but you didn't actually
I mean, there's a conversation, and then that's when the rubber hits the road. So we're not there yet. So, you know, I think it's going to be maybe another decade before we really start to see some legs behind that one. But you know, when I come to Toronto, the brand Canada just screams at us. But on the West Coast, we often think about Vancouver as the brand. Vancouver is the global brand. It's got a fantastic reputation. We don't leverage Canada like maybe Toronto might, or certainly Ottawa. And so we think a lot about continuing to promote Vancouver as that destination for investment, that destination for really innovative, creative, green companies that you know, would really enjoy taking advantage of everything that Vancouver has to offer. It's a different, and again, we often say there's Vancouver and then there's the rest of Canada.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because we talked about this earlier, and either we have a crisis of identity or we have a marketing and branding problem in Canada, because I think there are so many amazing brands. And I remember backpacking as a bit of a younger guy a couple of years ago, long time ago. And the flag, the Canadian flag, was such a proud thing that you could put on your backpack. And Canada as a brand is so strong. But what's amazing when we have these conversations is, well, what is Canada? And when I think about economic development and I think about growth and how we're going to attract talent, not immigration, how are we going to do this in a much stronger way so that, you know, when Amazons come, because Amazon is a big deal, but over the next decade, I imagine we're going to see 25, 30 more of these opportunities, or we should be creating our own opportunities. But what's our issue here?
Well, so this conversation starts to drive me nuts. One of the pleasures.
Have some more wine.
Yeah, actually I will. One of the things that was completely unexpected about producing the Amazon bid book and then releasing it was that it served as a mirror to ourselves. One of the reactions that I got that I didn't expect was people going, "Wow, look what we are." And, you know, congratulations on making the shortlist. And my answer to that one is, of course we should have made the shortlist. Come on, we're the fourth largest municipal area in North America. Second largest financial services sector, or third, or whatever. You can get into these arguments. What I think, the question of identity is one that I agree that we've got to go pursue. But if our identity are the Rockies, waving fields of wheat in Peggy's Cove, well then, you know what? Okay, enjoy yourselves. That's ridiculous. We are no longer that. And we have to be able to get to a point that we understand what we are. And it's an uncomfortable conversation, but what I think the three bids reflected back to the communities themselves was, realize what you are, realize what made you strong, realize what made you good, and that is inclusiveness, that is public health, that is public education, that is this incredible blend of all these communities that are here. Wave a big honking Canadian flag. We don't do that enough, absolutely. But what we would say is Canada is the brand, but your municipalities are the destination. But you know, it's a very Canadian thing to engage in the conversation about identity. Well, go read the three books. Go read and see what we are. And then go, okay, we understand what that is. Now we just got to go off and engage in the really hard work of selling it, because our profile is not what it should be.
Yeah, you know, I'm just going to pick up on that because we had the same reaction. We've been in the business for a long time. We put bid books together, we call them, all the time. We had a lot of this really good information. We put it on steroids, great. And then we had a lot of people coming back saying, wow, that's really great. What changed was the dialogue internally and the willingness to work with each other. So we kind of put down our own siloed approaches to doing things, and we said, this is worth going after. And we even went into it with the idea, we totally went in to try and win, but we knew there would be consolation prizes, silver. I'd like to say we have bronze. By the way, Ottawa does have Amazon in our backyard as well, and we got that a couple of years ago, but we're only up to 50 people. Hopefully that'll be more, Toby. But anyway, but the point was that dialogue changed, and the willingness to actually work with each other and actually, I'll show you yours if you show me mine kind of attitude started happening, right? And then the other thing for us, which is where we need to be. The other part that happened is, in our case, we brought another city on board that we would typically consider, maybe optically, to be a real competitor because it's a different province. And what did they do? They came to the table, they put everything on the table and said, take whatever you want from us, and wanted to be part of the bid. It's never been done. Just never was done before. That attitude, times that by every province and every city, is what we ought to be doing moving forward, or we're dead in the water.
So I'd like to link that in. I just think that's fascinating, the way this external bid can really change the psyche of our own identity, and it is an incredible opportunity. Earlier today, we had a conversation from Goldie Hyder in relation to the Century Initiative, and the Century Initiative is all about significantly expanding Canada's population to 100 million people. And it strikes me that there's a couple of themes here that are quite similar. He talked about the fact that we're just too nice as Canadians, that we have to be more forthright about our vision for the future, that we have to kind of stake our ground, believe in a dream, and then pursue the dream. And as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, well, you know, this is an interesting challenge that we have. We're sort of too nice, a little bit too passive. I have the same experience. I go speaking in different cities across the world, and as I bang the drum, people are fascinated by Toronto. They're fascinated by what's happening in Canada.
Yeah.
They think we have this incredibly special thing going on in Canada. And then I of course, come home, and someone is protesting a 2-story addition on a building, and it all, you know, falls apart and feels like we're incredibly stuck in a very, very small little universe. I'm wondering about this question of how we brand ourselves, how we begin to break down the silos and create a fundamentally new way of understanding both who we are and the role that we can play in the world, and how that links into this really big vision of the Century Initiative of adding a population up to 100 million people. I think there's actually a connection there, because we didn't talk about this with Goldie, but it strikes me that unless we can do the part you're talking about right now, we can't do the other part of significantly becoming this really profound powerhouse on the global stage.
Well, there's a lot to unpack. So when in what you're talking about. So one of the things that we chose to do, and we were speaking when we sat down with all our mayors and chairs and said, what is the tone that we want to create in the Amazon book? And it was this question of quiet confidence. And we were very upfront, and you can download the book from our website, where we were very confident about saying, look, this is what Canada is right now. We've had our debates about abortion. We've had our debates about gun control. We've done all that, and we actually did it without the kind of social disruption that's going to affect other countries. I mean, after all, I bet you we are the only bid book that's got a swear word in it. So go find it. It's the one that begins with F and ends with K. It's not fire truck. But I think that
that's quiet confidence.
Yeah, it's quiet, but it's quiet confidence. But what Amazon sees, which a lot of other companies are seeing, and again, it's the same across, is a quiet confidence in growth. The Amazon was quite taken that Vaughan, Markham, Mississauga, Toronto are undertaking this building. It's this growth. It's this sense that we're an open society, we're welcoming people to come in here, and we are growing. Now, is that going to happen forever? No. But contrast that to what has happened in the States, contrast that to what's happened in Europe. It was remarkable having the pleasure of putting that forward to Amazon and saying, look, pick whatever site you want, because if you're not going to occupy it, somebody else is. So
it's interesting you say that, because you know, one of the things that I remark all the time when I travel, and we do a lot of work in the United States and in Canada and other parts of the world, I don't think people realize that there are new downtowns being created in Toronto and in the GTA and the GTHA, and that's not happening. So when these bids went in, the 238, these are small towns that are saying, this could be our meal ticket. And
exactly.
you know,
that's exactly right.
I watch a little bit of TV from time to time, and Silicon Valley is a funny TV show if any of you ever watch it. And you know, one of the characters sort of said, you know, Bezos has Seattle and Sidewalk Labs has Toronto. What do I have? But the reality is Toronto has incredible, mature and sprouting places. So whether or not Amazon comes, you know, what are we doing about that? And if you sort of correlate that to Vancouver, which, you know, I spent years at Interwest, spent a lot of time in Vancouver, and in Ottawa, there's so much going on. That is the opportunity. So if we talk about how we're going to get to 100 million or 50 million, if we talk about what we're trying to do as cities, if we can start to build on that, I think our story about economic development and growth doesn't have to be about one engine. It's about what we can offer as a country.
So, you know, my humble opinion, I think the federal government of Canada needs to have a talent program, a global talent program in place. It's one thing to say we have immigration. We have little things like startup visa, okay. We have things called the new talent, the global skills strategy. And you know, arguably that's probably the best thing they've done in 20 years. But beyond that, we need a pretty aggressive program that needs to get fast-tracked. Even with that new program, and we take advantage of it. By the way, all the top 13 cities in Canada have all signed an MOU to work with the government on this new talent stream. But it's not good enough. We need to go beyond that. If we're going to grow to 1 million people, and I'll tell you, I take a high-speed train from one major city in China to another major city, and what do I see the whole time I'm going on that high-speed train that's going over 300 kilometers an hour? Cranes. Crane, 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 crane for 3 hours on a 300-kilometer-an-hour train. So I'm not saying that that's where all our steel is, but you know, that's another Trump conversation. But my point is, they're building like crazy. We're standing still. I'm not saying we need that breakneck growth, but we need talent in here because, again, they're right on our heels. Things are changing, the landscape's changing real fast.
But that's sort of the Century Initiative argument, which is, you know, if you don't have a population growth and if it isn't being expedited at a much more significant scale, then, you know, we're not going to see that kind of economic development growth in our country. We're just not. We're just not growing at that scale.
Yeah, to sustain a population, if you listen to people like Linda Duxbury out of Carleton University, she'll tell you that you need at least, it has to be over 1.1 or 2% growth for it to at least just go up. We're not even meeting the mark on that. And to really grow, you need 2% or more, right? So the Indias and Chinas of the world that are growing in those numbers.
Right. So I'm going to just change the subject a little bit back to, you know, in this exercise of preparing for the bid. So we don't normally, none of us normally would put a bid book together for 50,000 employees. That's an anomaly for sure. But as we went through that exercise, you know, Vancouver is very uniquely positioned as the gateway to the Asia Pacific. And we think about all these extraordinary companies that are growing, emerging. Many of them are copycats of great US giants. Alibaba, for example. We're ready for Alibaba now because we've done all the work. Alibaba is probably Amazon's #1 competitor. So we got an interesting playoff going on between, you know, two global giants in the same space could take up a footprint in Vancouver.
You don't need to take them all.
We'll take a few. Okay, help us out.
We'll help you.
Well, think about it a different way. You know, we talk about taking and getting, and the bid was all about attracting. And you know, you think about the KW marketplace, and we think about RIM and BlackBerry and what that did to seed the region. And we pale in comparison to Silicon Valley in terms of size. But how do we start thinking about, you know, I want to use the word aggressively, but proactively as a country, reinvesting in ourselves? Immigration will help to grow us, but making sure that we're going to be able to start exporting more than, you know, natural resources. And I think that that opportunity is something that would be interesting for me to hear from you, how we're going to start to do that. Because if we don't win, we've got lots of great things going on. How do we build on that?
Let me pick up on that theme, because I think there's an important question in there, which is attracting these super companies of the future, is that the best economic development strategy? Or is there another strategy that's more of a homegrown strategy that we should be pursuing?
Hold on. It's also, it's not an either or and either nor.
To both.
Because we are well past the period where we can just grow this ourselves. But that said, I think there's a lot of strategies that we can take in order to ensure the development of Canadian companies. And you know, you have to have a startup incubator culture in order to ensure that companies at the middle and the high level are going to continue to be able to profit and grow. If you don't have the whole ecosystem, there's no point in doing it. Should we expect that they are going to be the Canadian unicorns that are going to grow to these massive ones? Well, sure, why not? Let's think about that. But I think that the complexity of the global marketplace right now means that inevitably Canada has to be open to be able to match global supply chains. I mean, we were just talking about Alibaba, we're talking about Amazon. There are other massive, massive corporations that we're talking about that really are looking independently of borders. But you have to be spending your time on the fundamentals. It was interesting, I was at a conference speaking to the governor of Connecticut. And the governor of Connecticut, the major trading partner of Connecticut is France, which surprised me. He said, well, no, it's aircraft engines. They are an advanced manufacturing powerhouse. They do aircraft, submarines, a bunch of other stuff. And so I said, so what was the key to your success? And expecting to hear tax breaks. And he goes, I increased taxes and I invested in talent. I invested in community college, I invested in schools, I invested in quality of life.
And healthcare.
And so what happened? Like, they managed to keep their investments when nobody said they were going to be able to. So pay attention.
And
to the
Governor
fundamentals.
Malloy had a challenging time in Hartford, Connecticut, because they
that's
lost
right.
the insurance industry.
That's right.
And so how do they reinvent themselves?
Exactly.
So this is a really good next question, which is about reinvention and what the approach to reinvention ought to be. It's, I think, safe to say that when you look at the Amazon bids in general, here you had a series of cities essentially selling themselves really with a very similar premise, which was that a super company is good for our identity as a city, it's good for job growth, it's good for economic development. All of those cities, how many did I say it was? It was 293 or something. 283. None of them are reinventing anything by doing that. They're actually all embracing the exact same approach to economic development. And I guess the question is, I think this Connecticut example is a fascinating one. It's a very specific, strategic, who are we? What is our strategy? What is it that we have to contribute? And here, how are we going to go out in the world and, you know, carve out that space for ourselves in a global economy with a very clear identity to what it is that we offer the world? And I think this is a good question. Is there that kind of thinking or creativity around reinvention in our cities, or is it sort of the same everywhere?
But I think in our case anyway, and I can't speak for my colleagues, but it allowed us to dream beyond what we were doing. That was the secret sauce in this whole thing for Amazon. When you get something that is that big with 50,000 people, you have no choice but to think out of the box. And what it ended up doing, in our case anyway, is, I mean, look, first of all, I'll give kudos where we need to. City Hall and City Council has thought out, you know, 2020, 2030. They had all these plans. When this came to the table, I mean, you have to have them on the table because there's zoning, permitting, and all kinds of great things that you need. Well, now the dialogue's changed because we've rinsed and repeated on this. So much like Alibaba for you, we're running after Alibaba too, by the way. We should talk after, but it's
that's
to
sort of
you,
my point,
yeah,
right?
but it's to go into Ottawa to do a very similar thing. We actually took our video and all the stuff that's out online and repurpose it more generically to sell it to any big, massive company to get them in. So we, by default, we started that day we started that Amazon bid, we started thinking differently in our city.
But you know what was interesting when you think about the Amazon bid? It was a targeted and focused approach, and it was a reaction to an RFP. One of the things I think that Canadians and cities need to start thinking about is a targeted economic development strategy. We do this a lot, working with many of the different municipalities, developments. What are you looking for? It's lovely to sort of buckshot it out there and say, well, we just want new business, we want new opportunities. And so what is the opportunity for Canada to say, what are we really good at? Because I think from east to west, we have a lot of opportunities. And then how are we starting to target those opportunities? But as a country, I think that there's a real opportunity here to start thinking about that collective strategy from an economic development standpoint.
So
Well,
I think the answer lies in diversification. So if you want a resilient and sustainable economy, we need to continue to look at ways on how we diversify the economy. So, and this is so Calgary bid. Unfortunately, Calgary is not here, but we know the sort of the boom and bust cycles that Calgary is going through right now. Vancouver was a one-trick pony. In the 1970s, we were all forestry. Something like 52% of our GDP came from one industry. Now, there's not a single industry in Vancouver that accounts for more than 7% of our GDP. That's diversification. We are the most diverse economy in Canada now, and we have become quite resilient because of that. And I think, you know, cities like Calgary are still just, you know, trying to figure that out. And you can't blame them for trying to attract a lot of technology into the city as a way to really diversify their local economy.
But I think one of the things that we faced in Toronto Global was it was great to work for a couple of years to create this regional organization. So we got the governance. Believe me, working with our mayors and chairs to have the organization called Toronto Global was tough. But one of the things we then realized was that there wasn't a common economic development strategy for across the region. There were pockets of it. None of them talked to each other. And I think one of the greatest lessons that we learned was when you're starting to create this regional entity, you're actually creating something different. It never existed before. It's got a different dynamic. So we've just done a number of studies to start identifying priorities that we need to address that are going to sort of address the regional economic priorities for the region. So we did one in life sciences and we did one in financial services. So that gives our team the ability to go off and prospect. I get very worried when the Canadian government stands up and says, I'm going to pick winners and losers here. They have to recognize that they've got to enable regions to be able to push strategies up to them and be responsive to them. Because frankly, after a while, you get into the classic Canadian electoral cycle, and they're going to go, you know what, there's no way that I'm going to give anything to Ottawa or Toronto because the votes aren't going to be there. Allow the processes to come up from the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
So we're down to our last few minutes, and I'd like to just pick up on a theme we haven't talked about yet, but which has been a big part of our day today, which is housing affordability and the impact of these super companies. You can't talk about Seattle without acknowledging what's happening, Amazon without acknowledging what's happening in Seattle right now. The city of Seattle, for those of you who may not know, has recently imposed what is sort of called a homeless tax, is it not?
$250, yeah.
Yeah, so the idea being that large companies need to pay to address the lack of housing affordability. Amazon has reacted very badly to this proposal, which is interesting because, of course, it's one of the richest companies in the world, headed up by the richest man in the world, who has more money than most countries in the world. And reacted very, very badly with respect to this question, feels they're being unfairly blamed for the housing affordability crisis. And it really raises some important questions about housing affordability. Whose job is it? We were talking earlier, Bryan, about the fact that salaries are much lower in Vancouver than they are in Seattle. So here you've got, Amazon expanding into Vancouver because they can pay people less. I think we need to talk about this. This is actually a really critical part of this sort of smokestack chasing and seeing big companies as being critical to our economic development. They might be great for economic development, but they might not be so great for quality of life. Do you want to begin?
So here's a great question, for the audience. If Vancouver has lower than average salaries, as a way to attract companies to Vancouver, do you promote that fact? Should we be promoting that, hey, we're the Bangalore of North America, come on over. We will, in the local landscape, we just get hammered. You can't hide from all the local people that just don't want Amazon to come to Vancouver because the last thing they want is to be a sweatshop. So it's a very tricky balance. On the one hand, our talent is extraordinary, and so that is a competitive advantage. But if we start to promote it as a reason to come to Vancouver, then we get blamed for promoting the sweatshop mentality here. So it's very difficult. And of course, everybody knows about the Vancouver housing crisis. It's been going on for decades. And all kinds of really positive moves from the provincial and municipal governments on this file. But at the end of the day, I think salaries have to be bid up. In just our technology sector, we're averaging 6.8% per annum salary increase because it is a tight labor market, but it's still not enough. It needs to keep on going higher. So if you want to be a global city, start paying global salaries. And so Vancouver's got to grow up.
Yeah, we're going to jump over to both of you for your comments.
I think just on the housing thing. The first is that when Amazon, if Toronto is selected for Amazon, 50,000 people are not going to show up at the airport with their pajamas and pillows looking for a place to sleep. They are about 80% of the people that are going to be working for Amazon are going to be local hires. And that's over a 10-year period. At the same time, we're welcoming 90,000 people. So I think we absolutely have to take care of our affordable housing issue. No question. I think it's a separate question, though, from whether Amazon in our region is going to cause the problem. But we have to address it because it's a question of sustainability of our continued attractiveness to others. So we have to deal with that, no question. But just be careful because most of the companies that we deal with aren't doing relocations. They are coming here because of the talent we have. There are a few that we're starting to see where they're looking to get away from immigration issues in the States, but primarily what they're looking at is to come here to take advantage of the talent we've got, which is a totally different question.
Final answer?
So we live in a knowledge-based economy in our city, and the jobs tend to be in the technology industry, higher paid jobs. We've had this discussion many times internally about, do we go after, for example, contact centers? We had the darling of Ottawa at one point was Dell. They came in and they shipped all the jobs off to India. And you know, you read Richard Florida on clustering and knowledge-based economies, and frankly, our niche market is that whole area. There is a case to be made, though, that in order to help with the immigration, you need to have better immigration laws that allow people to come in, affordable housing so that they can live in there.
Yep.
And you start looking at the person that's coming in for potential jobs, and you start looking at the family tree after that, and the younger people that are going to come in the seed crop for tomorrow. I know we talked briefly about this, but there is a case to be made, and I agree with it, that we need to be mindful of that for the future. Because any way that we can build the 100 million, we ought to be looking at it, right? As long as it safeguards our country and everything is good on that front, and we have, you know, we can get people really well skilled with our universities that we have, which, by the way, our universities still are second to none around the world. We know that from comparative data. We ought to be doing it. And that includes affordable housing to get some of these folks in here, to get them up and rolling.
Well, this was a really, really engaging discussion, and really appreciate you making the time. On behalf of DREAM, we want to thank you for sponsoring the roundtable. I think, Jen, you have a couple final comments to make before we end ourselves, and we're the last thing standing between us and the bar.
So in other words, make it quick, sister. That's what that was. Well, first of all, please join me in thanking our panel. I think this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Bryan, Blair, Toby, for sharing your insights today. Of course, thank you to DREAM for sponsoring this as well. Before you make your way to the reception, which is sponsored by Carpenters and Allied Workers and Pinchin, I would like to express our sincere thanks to all of the speakers and panelists who joined us today. I think it's been an incredibly engaging and enriching experience. I hope that you feel that as well. Again, special thanks to my partner in crime, Rob, who took a very careful eye to thinking strategically about who we invited to participate. Thank you to all of you. We've had over 900 people participating in the conversation today. We're grateful that you were a part of this. The next conference of this nature will take place exactly a year from now in this same room, so be there or be square. And I would just like to say in conclusion that in keeping with the theme of not banging our drum enough, I think that one of the things that has become apparent to me throughout the course of this day is the caliber of this industry, the caliber of players that are engaged in making our cities and our regions inclusive and livable and sustainable. There are so many players that are coming from a variety of different sectors to this conversation precisely because they care about the future of their city, about the future of their region, and about the future of their country. And I think we should leave today really thinking very carefully about the challenge that Goldie put out to us today, which is, what's our legacy? What legacy are we leaving our children and our great-grandchildren? What is it? All the incredible advantages that we have in this country, how are we sort of holding that in trust and ensuring that we are making this country even better for future generations than what we have in fact inherited and benefited from? So thank you all for participating, and I leave you with that thought.
Thank you all.
Nice job.